Hey everyone, thanks for joining me for another video. I want to apologize that it's been so long since my next video. It is my worst fear come true. The reason why I didn't start this video series a few years ago is my fear that I would start and I would not complete them in a timely manner. So now that my worst fear has been realized, I am just going to move onward and upward. I'm not going to let my disappointment hold me back. And we're going to move on. So our last video was focused around the texts in Romans chapter 1, starting in verse 24, which is one of the texts that's used to debate homosexuality today, or to argue its unholiness. So we have begun dissecting the text by breaking down particular words and phrases to try to get a better understanding of Paul's intent with those writings. We started our last video with the word lust and exploring that. And if you haven't watched that video, I encourage you to go back and take a look at that. But in a nutshell, what we determined is that lust, or the Greek word that we translate as lust, actually means desire or to want something. And when used to describe wanting something that's unholy, we would translate that to the word lust. But in particular, there's several words that mean desire. In particular, the one that's used in this text, it is used to denote an intensity in that desire, or an uncontrolled desire is what that word really means. And in this text in particular, we know that it's in reference to sexual desires. So we're talking about uncontrolled sexual desires. Now, we know today that homosexual relationships exist that aren't driven by an unquenchable sexual appetite, but are motivated by mutual love and respect and a desire for companionship. So this really expands beyond Paul's understanding of same-sex acts, and therefore don't really qualify as what Paul deems as lustful in the text. So that all makes an assumption that we understand what Paul knows about same-sex relations. And so before we explore any more words, I want to take a step back and look a little bit deeper into what Paul and his contemporaries understand about same-sex relationships. And I want to start by saying that the word homosexual does not exist in the Bible, nor in ancient times, in the times that Paul lived. I often hear people say that there are texts that speak specifically to homosexuality, and I have to stop you right there and say there are not. There are texts that speak to same-sex acts, but not homosexuality as we understand it, which we would define as a homosexual would be a person that would have a preference for the same sex. But in Paul's time, it was really understood by Paul and the Christians in particular, but by society in general, that people's preference is always for the opposite sex, that our natural inclination is heterosexuality. And that acts with people of the same sex are merely fleeting encounters that are to satisfy an unbridled, perverted sexual desire, that there's some perversion in you. So we need to start with that understanding that homosexuality, meaning people that are born with a preference for the same sex, is not understood at all during Paul's time. So, additionally, during Paul's days, there are many unholy sexual practices that are both legal and socially acceptable. So Paul and the Christians of his time, they make this definitive kind of line in the sand where they definitively reject very particular sexual behaviors. So, for example, pederasty. Pederasty is a practice that predates Christianity by many, many years, but it's the practice that's basically a mentorship of an adolescent boy by an adult male. And this practice, this mentorship, would go beyond what we would consider to be wholly healthy boundaries and would include a sexual relationship. Pederasty was very common in the ancient world, and it still exists today in some places. The purpose and the customary practices, all of that kind of changes both over time and depending on the region that you're in, but it's both widely accepted and rejected, again, depending on when and where. Most ancient Greek men engaged in relationships with both boys and girls, adolescent boys and girls. Pederasty was part of the sexual ideology in Athens. You can see its acceptance just by looking at a lot of ancient art where pederasty is depicted. So while many have argued that these relationships were loving, mutually loving, I would argue that I think I and most of us that of sound mind would argue that a child or even an adult with the emotional or intellectual capacity of a child is not capable of fully understanding love, and that is merely a situation of manipulation and a power play. This text, in particular, Romans chapter 1 that we're exploring, is written to Christians from Rome. So we want to explore in particular what Rome thinks about pederasty, and as well as these other sexual practices that are occurring in mainstream society. Roman emperors, most of them were known to have child lovers. Roman men were free to conquer anyone sexually that they desired as long as they were in the dominant role. We will further explore in a separate video how the patriarchal society has really influenced our understanding of what's acceptable and not acceptable sexual behavior. But suffice it to say, Roman men, not women, again, free to conquer whomever, including men and boys, as long as they're in the dominant role. So men freely had sex with their own wives as expected, but also with prostitutes, with slaves, with entertainers, with minors. And any of these could be boys or men as long as they were not in that passive role, which was considered the position of the woman, and therefore considered a sickness if a man were to take the role of a woman. So many Roman emperors in particular, and men of power, were really known to have these insatiable sexual appetites, where, they would start with their wives, they'd move on to their slaves, they'd move on to their guests, to their siblings, to men, and to orgies, and oftentimes this may have been against their natural orientation. They may have been heterosexual, but their desire for this sexual power has grown so great that they've moved beyond even their own natural inclinations, as well as moved beyond what anybody would consider healthy or holy. With regards to military, war rape is acceptable among conquered men. It's not acceptable among soldiers within the same Roman army, but if it's somebody you've conquered, it's absolutely acceptable, again, being in that dominant role. Roman soldiers often had sex with slaves and anyone really under their authority. Generally speaking, unholy sex practices were really just prevalent in positions of power. So Paul and his contemporaries, they really only understood same-sex relations in these contexts of pederasty, of rape, of orgies, of other power play scenarios, but they never understood it in regard to a mutually respectful home governed by love and governed by God's will. Therefore, Christians' attitudes towards these sexual acts are really in part due to the violation of the basic human rights of all people, of the minors, the slaves, the women, the lower class citizens. None of these scenarios would be considered holy in the eyes of Christians then or today. So, today, if you recognize that same-sex relationships can exist without being driven by ravenous sexual desire or driven by a power move, but motivated by the idea of two adults in a mutually consensual, loving, committed relationship. If you believe that can exist, then you have to acknowledge that these relationships do not fall under the scrutiny of what Paul envisions in same-sex acts, in the same-sex acts that he describes. So this, coupled with the understanding that these relationships are also not what Paul describes as lustful, these really give us enough reason to kind of continue the conversation, continue to explore the underlying moral logic of these texts. So next we will explore why Paul believes same-sex relations are both impure and unnatural. Thanks, can't wait to see you then.